Good morning, Secondary 2 history students. This is Mr. Seow, and today I will teach you a lesson on the source-based scale of reliability. Before we begin, make sure you have the reliability skills notes with you. The notes are on Chapter 7b, the 1959 general elections. And so the lesson today is really about whether we can find a source reliable. In other words, do we believe a source? Do we trust it? Do we find what it says credible? And to teach you this concept of reliability, we're going to use an example directly related to you. So can you take out a post-it and write down the message of the following source? So this source says, the source is from a lesson for History 2 by Mr. Seow. This source says, for the history end of year exam, we will test you up to Chapter 5, Outbreak of World War II in Asia Pacific. Make sure to revise everything from World War I, Nazi Germany, militarist Japan, and World War II. The source-based questions will be purpose, surprise, reliability, and evaluation. So can we take a minute to write down what you think is the message of this source? So what is the message of the source? What has it told you about the end of year exam? It's that the end of year exam will assess many topics on world history, right? I think you saw that. So it's up to Chapter 5, Outbreak of World War II, Asia Pacific, Nazi Germany, militarist Japan. So these are topics in world history. The message that the end of year exam will assess world history and students are to be prepared. And Sec 2 students, at this point, you should realize or you should have this sense that this is very suspicious. Suspicious because you shouldn't remember, right, having done world history before. So how can we double check if it's true that you'll be tested about world history in the end of your exam? Well, firstly, you might know that lower secondary history is all about Singapore. Maybe you went to read the syllabus and you realize that it's not possible for me or any teacher to set an exam on Nazi Germany or militarist Japan. Secondly, you might go and ask another history teacher, such as Mr. Ricky, who might say, no, the Sec 2 students won't do world history. These are the topics for the Sec 3 end of year exam. In other words, actually, what you have done when acting on your gut feeling that your exam can't be so bizarre is you have checked the reliability of the source. In the first statement, your knowledge about lower secondary history being about Singapore, you have checked the reliability of source A by using your contextual knowledge. Your contextual knowledge contradicts the source, and therefore you find that the source is not reliable. For the second technique, where you go and ask Mr. Ricky, you have used another source to test the claims made by source A. In this case, this other reliable source has contradicted source A, and therefore you conclude that source A is not reliable. These, in a nutshell, are the two techniques that I will teach you today to test the reliability of a source. So how can we phrase and how can we frame the reliability question? These are the variants that you might find in any source-based setting. Is source A reliable? Can you trust source B? Do you believe what source C says? Is source D credible about something? And the way we would approach a reliability source-based question is, first of all, what is the source even saying? Get the message or inference out. Before we can test if a source is trustworthy, is reliable, is believable, is credible, we should first hear the source out. We should first understand what the source is trying to say, the claim the source is making. And once we have fleshed out the claim the source has made, we will test that claim against our own knowledge or against another source. If our knowledge or if another source has supported the claims made by the first source, then we would say, yes, the first source is reliable. If our knowledge or if the other source has contradicted and opposed the first source, we say the first source was not reliable. And if this is unclear to you, I encourage you to think of the previous example, replay this video, or think of any simple example to test whether or not something is true. Typically, you would Google and find another website to corroborate and to test the claims that you're trying to find out about. And so we'll do a reliability practice focusing on the 1959 elections in Singapore in chapter 7b, which we have just closed for the secondary 2 students. And you would have to draw on your own knowledge or on other sources in the set to test reliability. But fret not, for this practice, I will provide the knowledge. And if you need knowledge, you can also refer to your secondary 2 textbook. So let's proceed on to the worksheet. As stated earlier, I hope you have this set of notes with you. By the end of today's lesson, we will be learning how to test if a source is reliable, trustworthy, believable, or credible based on a cross-reference highlight to your contextual knowledge or another source. In other words, the main technique here to test reliability is cross-reference. It is a new technique that we'll introduce to you, and it's very important for future source-based skills. So what is a cross-reference? In short, you can write it at the side. A cross-reference is to test one source using another source or your own knowledge. So a cross-reference is to take one source and test it using another source. That's what a cross-reference means. So reliability questions ask you to decide if you can trust what a source says. And the first step is to find out what the source says. Right? Because I can't decide whether I trust what the source says until I know what it says. In other words, the first step is an inference. The first step is to get a message. The difference between inference and message, I have taught you this during the purpose lesson. I will repeat it now. An inference is made when the question has a question focus. The message is crafted when the question has no question focus. Right, so what can you learn from source A about the PAP's performance in the election? That's an inference. The PAP's performance was good, was bad, was poor, was stunning. These are inferences responding to a specific focus. What is the message of source A? That is a message question because there's no focus to guide you. You have to generate your own understanding of the source and craft the main argument of the source. So once we have the inference or the message of the source, we would cross-reference the inference or message against our own knowledge or against another source. And here are the keywords I would like you to focus on. If the original source is supported, then it is reliable. This should be quite intuitive, right? If the first source message is supported, in other words, the other source corroborates and agrees with the first source, then what the first source said is true, and therefore it's reliable. But if it's contradicted, opposed, or challenged by our own knowledge, then it is unreliable. I have gone through the phrasings or the framings and the craftings of reliability questions. You can look at these for examples, and I want you to move to this box. When the source is reliable, in other words, the source is trusted, can be trusted, it's because the source is supported by my own knowledge, or it's supported by another reliable source. So can you pause the video and fill in this box on the right by yourself? I think you have figured it out. Here it would be unreliable, the source cannot be trusted when the source's message is contradicted by my contextual knowledge. In this case, for this worksheet, feel free to use the textbook to provide the knowledge you need. The source's message is contradicted by another reliable source. I had one question in class from History 7. Do I need to do both? Do I need to both use my own knowledge and another source? Answer, no. Just use either your own knowledge or another source. I had another question. Do I need to write both reliable and not reliable? No. Stick to one side and you will achieve the full mark simply by explaining whether or not the source is reliable or unreliable. The basic steps are answering reliability. Always ATQ using the command word. So if the question is source A reliable? You should respond source A is reliable or source A is not reliable. If the question is do you trust source A? Similarly, I trust source A, I do not trust source A. Do not change the command word. After you ATQ, you pull out the inference or the message and then you do the xref. In other words, and you can write this at the side, it's ATQ, inference, and xref. These are the 3 steps to do a reliability question. And I'll proceed. Let's go to page 2. So this worksheet is all about the 1959 general elections. You might already have your textbook out to the relevant page and your 7B notes out to the relevant page. So you can recall that these elections were closely fought, were hotly fought contests after the Merdeka talks. On one side is the PAP, right, led by Lee Kuan Yew. It's a very powerful force at the moment. On the other side, actually the government, led by Lim Yew Hock, his Labour Front has split into 3 different parties because of a corruption scandal, and because of the acrimonious exchange between David Marshall and Lim Yew Hock. So at this point, Lim Yew Hock is leading the Singapore People's Alliance, and David Marshall has left the Labour Front, and David Marshall has created a new party which you might find familiar. He has created the Workers' Party, right? This is in 1959. So let's look at source A. Adapted extract from a speech by Lim Yew Hock, leader of the Singapore People's Alliance. So Lim Yew Hock, you can put in some knowledge. He's actually currently the chief minister. He's the one that succeeded in the second Merdeka talks. He was the leader of the Labour Front. In other words, he's actually a powerful force. If you had no contextual knowledge of this time, you would think that he's the incumbent meaning the current leader of Singapore. He stands a big chance of winning the election, right? But he is beset by a lot of problems, not least corruption, not least the defection of David Marshall, his former leader, and not least the fact that when he put down the student riots, he was brutal and violent and people didn't like him. And so he makes this speech. Of course, he has a purpose. He says it's our duty to fight to preserve the democratic way of life, to see that Singapore remains free. We cannot afford to sit on the fence. The term sit on the fence here means, not pick a side, stay neutral. So if you need to understand this term, sit on the fence, you want to use it for an English essay, it just means to stay neutral. That's what it means. Okay. The next lines are particularly interesting. If the PAP comes into power, they will carry out their unreasonable and radical communist program that will destroy freedom and democracy. So he has identified a big enemy is the PAP. Prevention is better than cure. Let's prevent the PAP from coming to power and thus preserve our security and prosperity. It's better than finding a cure for the certain ruin the PAP will bring to Singapore if it's allowed to take the reins of government. So Lim Yew Hock is really warning the people of Singapore, don't vote for the PAP in 1959 or they will destroy, right? They will destroy the country. Okay. Do you study source A? Do you trust what Lim Yu Hock says about the PAP's intentions towards Singapore? So first of all, I know many of you would have an instinctive, visceral conclusion. You would already have an idea of what you want to say, but hold it in, right? Because when we evaluate reliability, even though we know this bugger is making a political speech with a political purpose, and obviously he just wants to destroy his enemies, his political opponents, so that he can win election, hold it in. We need to start by evaluating the inference. Start by evaluating what it says. So, what are the PAP's intentions, right? When we think of the word intentions, we can think of positive or negative. So in this case, the inference is quite clear, right? Lim Yu Hock thinks that the PAP has a negative intention towards Singapore, and so I've put the inference out here. The PAP has a negative intention towards Singapore because the PAP wants to do communist program that cause suffering, restrictions, blah blah blah. Lim Yu Hock has said all these things, right? But the question is, whether or not we trust Lim Yu Hock depends on what we know. Because our knowledge would either have to support or contradict what Lim Yu Hock says. And in this case, let me give you a set of knowledge. This is purely for the reliability skill, and your knowledge can cut both ways. For this particular question, your knowledge can cut both ways. But let me give you a set of knowledge here. You will take it down, and I want you to figure out which side it cuts for this particular knowledge. Based on my contextual knowledge, the PAP had suspected communists in its leadership. Lim Chin Siong was a pro-communist leader who organized the 1956 student riots and had connections to the Malayan Communist Party. Violent. Okay, suppose I give you this knowledge. So in 1959, the PAP had suspected communists in its leadership. Lim Chin Siong, a PAP leader, was a pro-communist leader who organized the 1956 student riots and had connections to the Malayan Communist Party, and was put in jail for his role in the riots. So suppose you have this knowledge that PAP leaders, some of them are communists and they have organized riots. Then would this support or contradict Lim Yu Hock's views of the PAP's intentions? In this case, if you were using this knowledge, it's a support. And because it's a support, you trust. And because it's a support, you trust. And so you find what he says reasonable. And so I want you to notice that your knowledge will determine whether it supports or contradicts the inference. And from there, you decide whether you trust or do not trust. So the thinking and the writing process are different. So I'm going to just put this out here for a moment. The writing process, right? First is ATQ, second is inference, and third is cross-reference. But the thinking process, actually, first, you find out the inference of the source, then you figure out the cross-reference, and finally, you ATQ. Because you need to know whether or not your knowledge supports or contradicts the inference before you ATQ. So in other words, when you ATQ, you already should have a cross-reference in mind. Okay. And if you were to look at this response, how it works is, I trust what Lim Yu Hock says because he's reasonable in telling me that the PB had negative intentions. I trust because what he says about negative intentions are supported by my knowledge, based on my knowledge, so on and so on and so on. That's how you craft the answer. Okay. Now you might say, but Mr. Seow, what if I have no knowledge? It's well and good to have the textbook in front of me. It's well and good to have you in class so I can ask. But what if I enter an exam and I have no knowledge? Firstly, let me reassure you that's never the case because you would have been in all my lessons unless you were sleeping throughout, and you would have retained some sort of knowledge in the form of the memory of what I said in class. But suppose you really are unsure of your knowledge and you want another option, you can. And that is the second method. Sorry, before I do that, the first method is cross-reference to contextual knowledge. The second method is a cross-reference to another source. So in order for this method to work, I need to have read another source. So let's recap. Source A says that the PAP has negative intentions. What would another source say? So in this case, the other source we want to use is source B. What is the PAP's intention? Let's look at this source. The PAP's decision to contest all seats made it a front runner. The PAP aimed to be a government of the people, for the people, by providing stable and honest government. Right? The Singapore People's Alliance, led by Lim Yu Hock, accused the PAP of having a communist doctrine. So here it says that Lim Yu Hock accused the PAP, but in fact the PAP aimed to be a government for the people, of the people, and giving stable government. So this is the sentence we really want, the PAP's intentions. So I'm going to take this sentence. I'm going to park it here. So let's look at cross-reference to another source. I'm going to use source B, and I'm going to park the sentence here. So if this was the sentence we want to use, then what are the PAP's intentions? Well, in fact, source B tells me that using the same focus about the PAP's intentions. Sorry, let me close the window. Using the same focus of the PAP's intentions, right? Source B tells me that the PAP had positive intentions towards Singapore because it wanted to give Singapore, the locals, or an effective and fair leadership to improve their lives. That is the inference I would take away from source B. Positive intentions, effective leadership, improve locals' lives. And since this is positive intentions from source B, well, clearly it's a contradict. And because it's a contradict, you do not trust. And here it's not reasonable, it's either one-sided or biased, right? So you would go with Lim Yu Hock is one-sided in telling me this because, and also you do not trust because it's contradicted by source B. So I hope I've demonstrated to you how we can use another source to pull in the inference. Importantly, the contradiction here is very clear. Negative intentions versus positive intentions. Okay, I'm going to proceed to do question 2, and then I'll tell you your homework. So for question 2, it's source B, and happily we have already looked at this source because we needed to cross-reference something in source A. So let's look at this source now by itself. Source B, an informational article on the elections published by the National Library. Well, seems like a balanced sort of source, not going to be a political speech. The PAP's decision to contest all 51 seats positioned it as a front runner in the 1959 election. The PAP aimed to be a government of the people, for the people, providing Singapore a stable, honest, just government. The Singapore People's Alliance, led by Lim Yew Hock, accused the PAP of having a communist doctrine that would turn Singapore into a dictatorship if it was voted into power. Okay, great. Study source B. Is this source reliable? The command word is reliable in telling you about Lim Yew Hock's opinions about the PAP. So this is the focus, the question focus. Again, we would need to infer to the focus. Opinions, it could be positive, supportive, it could be negative. Let's look at the source. What does it say? Where's Lim Yew Hock? Here. Lim Yew Hock accused the PAP, accused, that's a pretty strong word, of having a communist doctrine that would turn Singapore into dictatorship if it was voted into power. So I think it's quite clear. Lim Yew Hock has negative opinions about the PAP, and we can do the inference already, right? Lim Yew Hock has negative opinions towards the PAP because he felt the PAP would take full control of Singapore and reduce locals' freedoms and choices. That's what a dictatorship means, having no choice and having no freedom. Okay, good. So we have the inference. And of course, you could have a choice whether or not you want to use contextual knowledge or another source. But for question 2, it so happens that there's one particular source in this set that aligns perfectly to this. Which source tells me about Lim Yew Hock's opinions? Of course, it is source A, because source A is Lim Yew Hock's speech. And so for this question, again, it's your choice what technique you want to go with. But for me, looking at the sources so far, it's quite obvious that source A is almost a perfect match. So I want to use source A. What part of source A do I want to use? This part, right? So this would read, source A tells me that Lim Yew Hock had negative opinions towards the PAP because he believed the PAP wanted to take away Singapore's autonomy and independence through their communist ideology. Okay. So this would be what source A says. There's a match because there's negative opinions. And so, in other words, it is supported, right? And because it's supported, I need to answer to the word reliable. It's reliable. And so it's reliable. And so reasonable. Okay. So does the whole answer make sense? Source B is reliable because it's reasonable in telling me that Lim Yew Hock has negative opinions, because he felt the PAP would take full control and reduce locals' freedoms and choices. Source B is reliable. because what it says about Lim Ho's negative opinions is supported by source A. Source A also tells me that Lim Ho had negative opinions because he believed the PAP wanted to take away Singapore's independence through their communist ideology. Yeah, tight. Makes sense. Perfect. So, through question 1, through question 2, I hope I have demonstrated to you the two techniques of cross-reference, either cross-referencing to your own knowledge or to another source. The important thing, as always, is to remember the three steps to reliability: ATQ, inference, and cross-reference. Of course, these are the writing steps. In terms of the thinking, you would do the inference first. You figure out, what's the source saying, and then you figure out your own cross-reference. What do you know? Is it a support or a contradict? And from there, you conclude: is it reliable or unreliable? Trust or do not trust. Homework. You would have to complete question 3 using about source C. And since you have done sources A and B, it should be easy to find a cross-reference or to use your own knowledge. You would also have to copy all the answers for question 1. So to make things easier for you, I'm going to put both answers here on the video so that you can pause the frame and then you can copy it on foolscap. And I did have a question from History 7 as to, okay, if it's on my notes, why do I need to copy it? And the answer is very simple. First of all, it's in the notes. Because the responses are in the notes in boxes, it means that it was not written by you, it was typed by me. But in fact, who has to do the learning? It's you. Let me copy this properly. It's you. So the nature or the nature of this exercise is that you need to do the writing in order to understand the way things are written. Secondly, this is an entirely new skill, right? Which means that you are not used to the writing scaffolds, you are not used to the writing technique. And so it's important to do writing in order to become familiar with the technique. So I have copied and pasted. Okay, let me remove this. I've copied and pasted the two possible techniques, the responses. Your homework, I reiterate, is to copy both paragraphs for question 1, as well as to do question 3 on foolscap, staple behind this worksheet. Of course, all the boxes in the worksheet must be filled in, and then you will submit it at the next lesson. Okay, I hope that this clarifies, and I hope you understand reliability in terms of the 3 steps and the cross-reference technique. Thank you. Have a good day ahead.